The goal of this series is to interview some interesting people with perspective about what the heck is going on with healthcare and what are the implications of it for the rest of us in the ecosystem. Those of us that would fancy ourselves to be innovators or policymakers or business types. The premise, as you know, is there's a lot going on and we had better be paying attention because things take a long time in healthcare, whether it's an innovation or anything else, and whatever assumptions we make today could very easily be wrong by the time our product gets to market. Pharma and biotech, anything having to do with drugs is being beat up in the press, right? You've got some bad actors out there. You got pricing controversies of huge magnitude. You've got mergers and acquisitions going every different way. You've got global markets. You've got Americans that are fed up with paying extra for their drugs so the rest of the world can have them more cheaply. You've got all these controversies. And meanwhile, science and medicine march on, so you're being buffeted from all sides. Is that the way it feels from the inside?
Let me just say that you could take the exact opposite perspective and say there's never been a more exciting time to be in biomedical science. I don't think it's chaos in the sense that it's random motion, but I think it's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. So, to sort of take a couple of the points that you raised, pricing has become a real issue. And it's a political hot potato. You see that this is really a problem. That if the perception is so different between the consumer saying, don't raise the price of our EpiPen, and pharma saying it costs $2 billion to develop a new drug, there's got to be some meeting in the middle. And I don't want to be an apologist for the whole pharmaceutical industry, but it is enormously complicated. And I think that some of the things that I think we're likely to talk about over the next hour are an attempt to sort of bring that containment down to the point where it's not $2 billion to develop a drug, and a recognition that, in this country, we have access to medicine that other people don't have, and we develop basically the world's new innovation when it comes to biomedicine. So, there's a cost that we have to pay, and I don't think we've quite figured that out.
When I think of a small company, I think of the opportunity to just flat out develop new molecules, right? To do new technology. But when I think of a big company, I go back to this macro picture and say, there's a lot wrong besides the inadequate number of new molecules. The business model is in question. The clinical trials are extraordinarily expensive and complicated, and there are a lot of people questioning whether we have to have some fundamental redefinition of how drugs are developed. Do you have any perspective on that?
The stuff that we're interested in as scientists and physicians, and the innovation is of no relevance to people that are, funding these programs and dealing with stocks. So I took the perspective of going to Fraser and starting a company. I thought, well, I'd been at a couple that I didn't really see had worked very well. And so I was going to, fail on my own and not have to explain to anyone that it wasn't my fault. And so we started this little company that never got bigger than 20 people, raised about $50 million over a 10-year period. And I saw with 20 people that we dosed 650 patients with our drug. And we did things that a big company could never do. And we did a partnership with Celgene, which brought me to Celgene, and now I've been sort of taken into the fold and seen what it's like in a bigger company. And it's like when I tell my kids, it's not better or worse, it's just different. It is extraordinarily different. So if you now sort of split that question into two, is there something about the way we develop drugs that needs to change? And the answer is yes. But organizationally, I've become a believer that it is not only 100% people, which is totally cliche, but it's that people in large groups do terrible things. They treat each other poorly, they connive, and they get nervous and they're afraid. And you get into these organizations where people are protecting turf, and they're protecting themselves, and they're protecting programs for fear of not being employed, and it's it has nothing to do with pharma. It has to do with human behavior. So I think it's a cultural shift that has to occur once a drug gets to a certain point, and that's usually after clear proof of concept is established. I think a big pharmaceutical company is extremely efficient and effective at developing those drugs. Taking it through registration studies, dealing with regulators, and certainly commercial launch. But it's that intersection between where the innovation occurs that I think we're struggling.
So you're suggesting that sort of a division of labor, according to what the cultures are actually good at. Big companies who can handle some of this in the trenches, get it registered, get it tested type of stuff, and the little companies can innovate in other ways, and so there's a complementarity there.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a really complicated food chain, and you think about the number of tasks that are required. It's not a surprise that you're going to see companies that do extremely well at one thing, but not necessarily at another. So I think there is a cultural aspect and a grittiness that you have to maintain to be innovative, and I think that's where we're stumbling a little bit. And I just don't think it's unique at all to pharma.
So you could make your mark in a big company of the kind you're hoping for by being rigorous, not just by being the champion for your favorite
Absolutely. In fact,
but
it's
actually being hard-nosed about it.
When I'm with this crowd, I always think about where's the role for innovation. And when I think of biotech and pharma, you always latch on to the molecules. But I'm wondering about other dimensions of possible innovation in this whole therapeutic sector. We're certainly getting into the era of precision medicine, right? We know more and more. We're segmenting patients more and more. And as a consequence, as that goes forward, we don't need 15 new drugs. We need 500 new drugs, for all these subpopulations. And the existing methodology for proving those in clinical trials just won't sustain it. Yeah. The smaller the applicable population, the more burdensome the clinical trial thing. Precision gives you diagnostics that you can use to segment populations, and so efficacy trials actually do get smaller, right? Because we can segment. But nobody's figured out how to crack the safety problem. The safety trials have to be gigantic and therefore expensive, but more and more movement toward post-market surveillance kinds of stuff. Yeah. Now, is that a theme of what's going on? And then I back up, I look at this crowd, this town, and I say, wait a minute. This is the era of big data. Why don't we have data on every bloody patient in the country and the drugs they're taking? And why don't we just pull safety out of the avalanche of data? What are we missing here?
I don't think you're missing anything. I think you're spot on, actually. And I think that I've been fortunate to work in oncology where we've led the way. And it wasn't until I became more involved in non-oncology drug development that I realized how much further ahead oncology is. I mean, you think about it, number one, you've got this therapeutic index in cancer patients, which can be much narrower than in many disease areas, right? So you can tolerate, life-threatening toxicities as long as there's an ostensible clinical benefit. The other thing is, name another disease where people walk into a clinic in New York and get their genome sequenced and their disease sequenced, right? Baselga has made it absolutely, 10,000 patients walk in and get their genome sequenced. So we're pushing ahead with oncology. And I think that's where a lot of the innovation is occurring. So you're looking at the emergence of adaptive designs. And I've been at this long enough to have dealt with FDA a lot. And there's always this criticism from business and banking that the FDA is retarding drug development and they're slowing us down. And I think that's just patently untrue. I think, think about the mission of the FDA. It came out of the need for safety and regulation around products that could hurt public health, could negatively affect people's health. Not, you walk into the FDA, they never really probe you about the efficacy component of your data. It's always about the safety. And it's going to take a while before, that moniker is changed towards sort of relative safety.
And the intuition is that we need innovation all across the board. We need innovation at the regulators. We need innovation at the trial designers.
Absolutely.
Not just in the molecular lab.
I don't worry about the technology. You can't sort of look at this device and think that we can't solve every technical problem. It is much more of a statistical and a regulatory problem. That we have the requisite tools now to make molecules better than before, to study them, to interrogate human samples in a way that we couldn't even have imagined.
Are we in the era of immuno-everything?
Of course. I joke that there's not a disease that an immunologist can't explain immunologically. It's hard for me to imagine a world where immune-based therapies won't touch every disease that we work on.
The great missing thing in healthcare is actually prevention, right? And if you would just back up and say, what about prevention? Well, what's the best preventative strategy? Arguably, it's a really robust immune system.
There's a challenging economic question embedded in
Yes,
that,
there is.
which is, who's going to pay for preventative medicine, and how do we study? I mean, if you just look at, again, cancer as a proxy, right? We spend a lot of our early development dollars on late stage cancer, stage 4 cancers, untreatable cancers. Most drugs will go into late stage cancer as the first trial and will migrate up. And if you look at Herceptin as a good example, it was approved in metastatic and late stage cancer, and it wasn't for 5 or 10 years before the adjuvant trials, which were 5,000, 6,000 patients, were showing the benefit in the adjuvant setting, which is still already after someone's been diagnosed. This idea that these preventative, number one, we just aren't that smart scientifically yet, but even from a trial design, payer, I almost feel like that's almost too big of a problem to grasp.
But you touched on two things. One is, diagnoses that are not actionable are pretty debatable, right? But you also mentioned the fact that economics enters in here too.
Absolutely.
We're encouraged to give vent to our natural desires for miracle drugs. We want drugs that cure diseases, right? Because and we got some.
Yeah.
But the economic models of cure, there's two opposing points of view. Like, who wants to develop a drug that you give once and that's it, right? Where's the money in that? But on the other hand, we've got lots and lots of experience with vaccines, which are the model, right? And so, how does this work when you're thinking about either a startup biotech company or a big pharma?
If you look at some big pharmas, you can look for the big ones that do have vaccine. They still have vaccine groups, and they're still looking at infectious disease as a business unit. I've been involved in venture and still am for better part of 15 years now, and it's really hard for a company to undertake a preventative or early intervention strategy unless there's a suitor in mind. I think that small companies have to deal with these complex questions, and it's always important to get that feedback from someone, who are you developing this for? We have to be careful a little bit of what we wish for. You look at CAR T therapy, which we're very involved in, and even NICE in England has estimated that curative therapy, the price they put on it, is $750,000 a treatment. So what you're seeing is that we were talking about this before, what a payer is. I'm not going to go there because I don't know. But what society will value,
Right.
And this idea that it's per month of extended life. There's a monetary conversion. People will pay for therapies of curative intent. You could make a very strong argument that might not be where society wants to put all its money. But from a business model for companies, there still is, a lot to be gained, both at every level, clinically, scientifically, and financially, from expensive therapies that do good. It's just the paradox that we have to deal with.
If you think about drug innovators, whether they're coming out of a science lab or whatever, or resurrecting an older drug or whatever, what advice do you have for somebody who's going to start a new company or push a new therapeutic these days?
So my first comment would be to do it. I can't describe to you how satisfying what I do is I don't think there's ever been a time when we can do more in biomedical science. We've been talking about this for decades. The second thing I would say to people is embrace computational medicine. Don't shy away from the new tools, because what we're seeing is the insights that can be gleaned computationally are so different from our perspective, the way we've developed drugs before, that I think one has to embrace, particularly in a situation when you're innovating, all of the tools available to you. Be positive, absolutely categorically do it. And the other thing is always that, don't worry about failing, because no matter how efficient we are, and no matter how precise our tools are, we're still going to fail more than we succeed. This is complicated. Don't be afraid to fail, and don't be discouraged by failure, as long as you learn and keep moving forward.
My experience in big pharma was that people are incentivized by the company not to weed out things.
Yes, exactly right.
People's career paths are rewarded for not killing things and for, in fact, advancing them even without rigor. The business model of big pharma doesn't reward people for trimming down things to the best. So the failure rate is embedded in kind of the reward structure. And I guess my question is, do you think there's a way that $2 billion price tag could be greatly reduced if we could figure out a way to get incentives to match rigor?
Yes, in a nutshell. I hope I am not being perceived as an apologist for high prices for drugs, because that's not how I feel. I don't think that's how anybody feels. This is not a sustainable model for the industry or society. So I don't think there are many apologists for this. I think there is an element now for some of these drugs. It is a price that people will bear, and it's, we're in a transition from a pharmacoeconomic perspective and from a societal perspective. So I think drugs that have arrived at this point are not going to change. I think people will continue to extract as much value. Certain groups that don't have the diversity of a portfolio, that are relying on growth based on pricing, it's becoming more of a minority. It takes a commitment from the senior leadership to say, enough. We're going to change this to people being rewarded for success in a very different way. And I think that's going to happen industry-wide. And it's not this total altruism, it's just we can't do it anymore. So I think it's, my sincere hope is that it's going to continue to change. But your points are well taken, and I'm not here, as you know, to sort of apologize nor to disagree. Just we have to be better.
Just maybe come back to the R side of the R&D equation. You spoke to some of the macro trends happening now, and I experienced that. I worked in the research side, Immunex Amgen, for about 20 years, and I've seen a lot of these trends. Interestingly, even though the R side of the equation in terms of total cost is relatively small compared to the D, from the outside investment world, it's what gets the most pressure to make cuts, probably because of all the studies showing the lack of productivity in terms of research and returns over the last 20 years. So as a consequence, you're seeing more pressure to outsource research, either to small biotechs or to academic centers, which I think can work, but it has its own trade-offs, one of which is you're seeing incredible bidding wars now for even preclinical assets. Sometimes they're commanding up to $500 million. And the other comes back to what you touched on, to these, this real need for stringency and best practices that need to guide you from the very beginning, in the 6 R's or however you want to think about it. But oftentimes when you're needing to bid on things from externally, you don't have a lot of control over the amount of rigor that went into those, and yet you're still in a bidding war with others just because there's so much competition. And,
Yeah.
and I don't know what the answer is, but I've seen it and lived through it.
The pendulum swung probably 5 years ago towards this total outsource model. And if you look at it in R or D, I think what people realize that if you go completely outsourced, you're going to fail. You need an infrastructure internally to deal with this model. And whether it's chemistry abroad or in the States, or whether it's CRO management, I think the pendulum on that side of sort of true outsourcing, moving back towards a blended model, and I think it's logical. And as you remember, I'm sure from the days at Immunex and Amgen, it's a dollar and cents argument. How much does it cost versus what's the return? I've been in R&D for a while now, and what I like to tell our folks is that research is a privilege, not a right. You have to be able to deliver something tangible to the organization to create value. These people are creating value because they're getting sales, whereas the research people are not. And so I think that's getting a little bit better. And now, because I think if you count on small companies, their incentives are almost the polar opposite, right? They're not looking to get things into development, they're looking to get bought. And so that can create sort of strange incentives and quirky behaviors that in the end don't serve the ecosystem very well.
So here at the Canby Grove, we see a lot of big data, health IT, digital health, and other health tech companies. And so my question is, I think ultimately about getting at who's willing to pay for what. And the whole connection of the big data and the drug and the widget or the device that told you the drug was taken, that goes to your phone, that tells the medication adherence group that you avoided, a costly incident because you got the drug in there. That whole package seems like something valuable. How is anybody looking in big pharma at how to deliver the package through build, buy, or partner? And that payers or providers at risk would find that very compelling, and that's a unique and different business model that seems to be kind of nascent right now.
So I think you're describing the future, and again, Google's just one group that we've seen recently, but everything from caps that send to your phone that you've opened it, a contact lens that senses glucose, a watch that pricks you and draws blood and sends it to your doctor, to digitizing electronic medical records further and subdividing and doing outcomes research. I mean, this is the world that we're going to exist in. And, so it's not going to be 2 years, maybe it's 8 years or 10 years. So this is where people are going. Right. So it can't be done internally. It's got to combine some external tools. And one approach would be just go end to end with an Apple or a IBM or a Google and say, here's our problem, you put it together. I think companies like Celgene and most big pharma will want to build certain pieces because the stakeholders are going to be everyone from the commercial people looking for outcomes and the late stage clinical people that are looking for integration of big clinical data, to the early scientists that are trying to figure out what to do with RNA-seq data and stuff that they computationally can't figure out in a systems approach. And so I personally think that this is where companies have to be really smart and targeted. I think it's imagine a world where all of this is integrated, where a company can basically own a disease from molecule to outcome. It's all going to be based in data. And I think that I get the sense that people are inching towards it, but like everything else, it's starting to accelerate. And that's why, frankly, I'm so optimistic, because there's going to be utilization of these tools, and that's what's going to drop the price down, unbelievably.